way. I guess we'll run with it. That's not what I wanted to do at all. I just spent all day setting up my computer for this. I guess it doesn't matter. We can do it the wrong way. Anyway, welcome to the playback. Welcome to the live stream. I'm so glad you're here. And we are going to read questions to Trump voters. I'm going to have to rearrange my screen here, so bear with me for a second. I had it set up to share my screen with you, but I will just share my face with you. Let's see. Uh-oh, why is this so little? Zoom, that's the problem right there. That was the whole problem with setting this up to begin with. I tell you, doing things on the computer is not nearly as fun as you think it should be, because everything just does not flow on the internet well enough. The programmers and the people who own the social media platforms, they just like want to stay separate. Like, it doesn't really matter that they don't program well enough. And they just don't offer enough solutions. Like, YouTube doesn't offer a screen sharing feature. You can't do a vertical and share your screen in a vertical format and also record in a horizontal format at the same time. That doesn't make any sense. You should be able to record vertical and horizontal both at the same time, so you can get the viewers from the vertical live stream plus the longevity of the horizontal format. I'm sorry for the background noise. If I wait till it's quiet, there will be no one awake to watch my live stream. What is going on here? This is a horrible start to a video. This is not how you start videos. You start your video off right. You should start with a hook and be very engaging in the very beginning of your video. Okay, let's start with, hold this window open so many times. My computer does not want to hold this window open for some reason. All right, we're going to start with what it read. All right, listen. This isn't a video for people who want to argue for the sake of arguing. This is for the men who voted for Donald Trump and who might not have taken a real moment to sit with what that vote actually meant. I'm not here to scream at you. I'm not here to flatter you either. I'm here to talk to you, not about you, not around you, but to you. You made a choice that helped shape the direction of this country, and that choice had consequences for millions of people, for democracy, and for how we treat each other. So this video is 210 questions. Not rhetorical, not sarcastic, real, direct questions. You may not agree with all of them, maybe any of them. But if you voted for Trump, especially if you plan to do it again, you're not really entertaining the dictator for a third term in your mind still, are you? I would certainly hope not. AI has had a weird time warp today where it thinks it's 2024 still when it comes to politics. It's very bizarre. You may not agree with all of them, maybe any of them, but if you voted for Trump, especially if you plan to do it again, I'm asking you to at least hear them. And as I read these, I want you to really ask yourself, am I okay with what I supported? Would I support it again? And what does it say about what I believe in? Because if you're not even willing to ask yourself hard questions, then what kind of future are we really building? Let's get into it. Okay, give me a second. Let me open this window. Bad human habits unveiled was how this conversation started, but I will stick to my questions about Donald Trump. I really do not like the social media platforms really embracing this very conservative dialogue, considering how much the social media platforms have suppressed true leftist voices who actually want to keep the human beings of America, and also, you guessed it, the entire world alive. America doesn't exist in a vacuum. It looks really big. It is really big, but it's not really big compared to the rest of the world. It's 5% of the landmass of the world, roughly. 5% of the population, roughly. You can go ask Grok if you want better details. It corrected me because it's something like 4 point something percent and 6.1% or something ridiculous like that. But roughly 5% for both is a pretty good way to memorize. Oh, I can make the computer read it. I forgot that was my whole plan. Well, let's let the computer read it. I will make cute facial expressions. I was really impressed with these this morning when I had this right at AI and ChatGPT right for me. Hopefully it's going to read.
I apologize for misunderstanding your request. I now understand that you're asking for a direct, conversational approach to address the men who voted for Donald Trump, speaking to them explicitly rather than just analyzing their actions from a third-party perspective. Let me rework this as requested. 1. You voted for Trump, and by doing so, you played a role in normalizing divisive rhetoric that now permeates our society. Have you thought about the ways this fuels hostility between people who should be finding common ground? 2. When you backed him, did you realize how much you were empowering a leader who pushed policies that often seemed to disregard the core principles that our democracy stands for? Do you reflect on the consequences of that? 3. Your support made it easier for Trump to chip away at the public trust in our institutions. What do you think that does to the fabric of our society when we can't rely on the very systems that are meant to protect us? 4. Many of the policies Trump put in place disproportionately affected marginalized communities. Did you consider the long-term effects on people who are already struggling when you cast your vote? You helped give power to an administration filled with ethical controversies. How does it feel knowing that your vote was part of the reason a leader who didn't seem to value transparency rose to power? 6. By backing Trump, you contributed to an environment where misinformation spread unchecked. What do you think the lasting damage of that is, especially when the truth becomes so elusive? Supporting Trump also meant supporting rhetoric that often incited violence. Did you stop to think about how those words impacted people in real, dangerous ways? 8. His policies rolled back vital environmental protections that we can never get back. You voted to ignore future generations. Did that weigh on you at all when making your decision? 9. You stood behind an agenda that often seemed to prioritize immediate gains over long-term stability. Is that truly the kind of leadership you want to see for your children and grandchildren? 10. Your vote helped tear apart international relationships that took decades to build. Did you ever think about what that means for the country's standing in the world and your own future? 11. Trump frequently clashed with the media, attacking free press, the cornerstone of a functioning democracy. How do you feel about undermining this vital institution in the pursuit of power? 12. His administration appointed people based on loyalty, not qualifications. Was that something you were comfortable with, knowing that the people in charge were often unfit for their roles? 13. By supporting Trump, you backed a leader who rarely showed accountability for his actions. What kind of example does that set for the future? His policies have often been described as regressive, but you voted for them. Do you think we're moving forward as a nation, or are we falling behind with each of these steps backward? With your vote, you helped contribute to the political climate we have today, where civility and respect seem harder to find. Are you satisfied with how we talk to each other now, or would you like to see a change? 16. Trump's administration made it harder for dissenting voices to be heard. When you supported him, did you think about the effect that would have on the diverse range of opinions in our country? Trump's actions often contradicted the values he claimed to uphold. Does that give you pause, knowing that the rhetoric didn't match the reality? 18. By supporting Trump, you helped shift the country toward authoritarian policies. Is that the type of future you envision for America? One where checks and balances no longer matter? His tax cuts favored the wealthiest among us. Does that sit well with you, knowing the majority didn't benefit in the same way? 20. Your vote played a part in the deepening political divide. Can we really say we're better off when the gap between us and them keeps growing wider? Trump rejected science on climate change and you supported him. Do you think it's wise to ignore the very experts who are trying to protect our planet for future generations? With your vote, you backed the erosion of healthcare protections for millions. Did you ever stop to consider the people who lost their insurance because of decisions made under his administration? 23. You supported an administration that was erratic and unpredictable. Was that the kind of leadership you thought was best for this country? One where decisions seemed to be made on a whim? Trump's immigration policies were harsh and cruel. How do you reconcile supporting an agenda that separated families and treated people fleeing violence as criminals? You stood behind a man who couldn't keep his own staff in place. How do you feel about an administration that seemed to thrive on chaos and instability? Supporting Trump meant voting against climate action. Do you think we can afford to keep ignoring the environmental crises we face? You helped push policies that hurt workers' rights and protections. Do you believe that's the kind of future we should be building, one where the working class is left behind? 28. Your vote helped expand surveillance programs that encroach on our privacy. Is this the kind of government you want, one where personal freedoms are compromised for safety? Trump rarely accepted responsibility for his actions. How can we trust leaders who refuse to hold themselves accountable? 30. The tax policies Trump enacted overwhelmingly benefited the wealthy. How do you feel about a tax system that deepens inequality, leaving ordinary people to bear the burden? You voted for a leader whose rhetoric often targeted minorities. How do you feel about a country where certain groups are demonized because of who they are? Your support helps isolate the United States from global alliances. How does that benefit you, your family, or your country in the long run? 33, you backed an administration that often ignored expert advice. How comfortable are you with putting power in the hands of those who refuse to listen to people who know better? Trump rolled back crucial public health protections. Did that concern you, knowing that it put countless lives at risk? His actions contradicted basic legal norms. Does it worry you when the leader of a nation is willing to ignore laws for personal gain? Your vote helped push policies that many considered discriminatory. Is that the kind of America you want to see, a place where some people's rights are more important than others? By supporting Trump, you contributed to the weakening of democratic institutions. Do you think this is the type of system you want to live in, where power is increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few? 38. Your vote undermined trust in the electoral process. What does it mean for democracy when the integrity of elections is questioned by those in power? Trump often prioritized his own interests over the nation's. How do you feel about a president whose agenda seemed to be about personal gain rather than public service? By supporting Trump, you helped implement foreign policies that were often criticized. Do you think the world is safer and more stable because of the choices made by his administration? You voted for a man whose words often incited division. How do you feel about the country's state of division today and your role in contributing to it? Trump's judicial appointments raised concerns about their impartiality. Does it bother you that so much power is now held by judges who may not have been appointed based on merit? 43, his administration's unpredictability was a hallmark. How do you feel about supporting a leader whose decisions often seemed erratic and destabilizing? You voted for a man who ignored income inequality. Does that sit well with you, knowing that the gap between the rich and poor continues to widen? Trump frequently clashed with civil rights organizations. How do you feel about a president who made it harder for people to fight for their basic rights? 46. You supported policies that hurt public education. How do you feel about a system where education, an essential pillar of democracy, is being undermined? By backing Trump, you helped create a political climate where human rights were often disregarded. How do you feel about standing behind someone whose policies contradicted the basic ideals of equality? You voted for an administration that expanded military interventions. Do you think war and conflict are the answers to global challenges? Trump's diplomacy was often criticized as ineffective. Do you think it was in the best interest of the country to undermine global cooperation? Your vote contributed to the deepening political divide. Do you think it's worth it to keep dividing the country, or should we start finding ways to heal and unite? This is a direct conversational approach aimed at speaking to the men who voted for Donald Trump, urging them to reflect on their choices and the consequences those choices had on society. Certainly, I'll continue directly addressing the men who voted for Donald Trump, ensuring each response offers a unique perspective without repetition.
51.
When you voted for Trump, did you ever question how his rhetoric affected the mental health of those around you, creating a climate of fear and division? Trump's disregard for international agreements hurt the global reputation of the United States. Have you considered how that undermines our standing in the world? Fifth, supporting him meant backing a government that openly questioned the legitimacy of the media. How does it feel knowing the very fabric of free speech and truth was so openly attacked? His administration's stance on healthcare left millions vulnerable. Were you comfortable knowing that your vote contributed to taking away access to life-saving care for those who needed it most? At 55, when you voted for Trump, you enabled the widespread disregard for women's rights. How do you reconcile that with the women in your life, your daughters, sisters, or mothers, who are impacted by those decisions? Under Trump, there was a disregard for civil rights protections for LGBTQ+ people. Does it sit right with you to support policies that discriminate against people based on who they love or who they are? Trump's inability to accept responsibility for his actions was a key feature of his presidency. How does that align with the values you hold, values of accountability and integrity? 58, your vote helped normalize racist and xenophobic language. How do you feel about supporting an agenda that legitimized hate and division in the name of populism? You cast your ballot for a man who was often indifferent to the suffering of those in poverty. Did you think about how his policies impacted the very people who need help the most? 60. By voting for Trump, you backed an administration that gave corporate interests even more power. How does that make you feel, knowing it's the working class that suffers the consequences? Trump's policies often favored the wealthy over the working class. Does it seem right to you that a system is in place where the richest continue to thrive while the majority struggle to get by? 62. His stance on climate change ignored the overwhelming scientific consensus. Do you think we can afford to keep ignoring evidence, especially when it impacts the future of the planet? You voted for a man whose administration prioritized deregulation that allowed industries to harm the environment. How do you feel about policies that put profit over the planet's health? His administration didn't just turn a blind eye to human rights abuses abroad, it actively facilitated them. Can you stand behind supporting a foreign policy that compromised the basic rights of people around the world? Trump created a presidency built on chaos and unpredictability. Do you think that kind of instability is healthy for the future of our nation? You helped empower an administration that continuously attacked the rule of law about voting for a leader who showed little respect for the legal framework that keeps our society running smoothly. 67. Trump's stance on trade deals hurt American workers. Do you think it was worth sacrificing the long-term stability of the US economy to prioritize short-term political gains? 68. His administration's lack of respect for workers' rights meant the people who actually build this country were left behind. How do you feel knowing that your vote didn't consider the needs of hardworking Americans?
69.
When you cast your vote for Trump, you supported an administration that was often more concerned with image than substance. How do you reconcile that with the values you hold dear? His rhetoric and actions exacerbated racial tensions across the country. How do you feel knowing your vote contributed to such a divided America where racial animosity is on the rise? 71. You helped create a political atmosphere where disinformation thrived. How do you feel knowing that you were part of an environment that made it harder for people to trust anything they read or hear? Trump's foreign policy seemed to put America's allies at risk. Can you justify supporting a leader whose decisions weakened our relationships with countries that have traditionally stood by us? 73. When you voted for Trump, you helped elect someone whose policies on education were harmful to future generations. How do you feel about an education system that leaves so many children without the resources they need to succeed? By backing Trump, you supported the erosion of public trust in government. How does it feel to be part of a movement that works to undermine the very institutions that protect democracy? His administration wasn't just ineffective in addressing the pandemic, it actively made it worse. Can you reconcile voting for someone whose actions cost so many lives? You voted for Trump, a man who often dismissed expert advice on crucial issues like healthcare, climate change, and public safety. How do you feel about supporting a leader who ignored the people who actually knew what they were talking about? 77. His policies were often more focused on enriching the wealthy than improving the lives of ordinary Americans. How does that sit with you when you think about your community and those who need help the most? By supporting Trump, you helped make it harder for women to access reproductive health care. How do you reconcile that with the need for personal autonomy and freedom of choice? 79. You cast your vote for a man whose actions undermined efforts to combat systemic racism. Does it feel right to you that the policies you supported continued to oppress those who are already marginalized? Trump's divisive rhetoric led to more hate crimes and violence across the nation. Can you stand behind a leader who seemed to fan the flames of hatred and division? 81. You voted for an administration that took a hard stance against immigrants and refugees. How do you reconcile that with the values of compassion and kindness that so many of us were taught growing up? Trump's economic policies benefited the rich at the expense of the middle and working classes. How do you feel about a system where the wealthy continue to get richer while everyone else struggles? 83. His failure to address the opioid crisis was a direct result of prioritizing other issues over public health. Do you feel okay supporting someone who neglected the very real health concerns affecting so many people? Trump's attacks on women's rights and gender equality are undeniable. Do you really want to be on the side of history that failed to protect half of the population? 85. His presidency focused on deepening divides, not bringing people together. Can you honestly say you're proud of the impact your vote had in splitting the nation further apart? Supporting Trump meant supporting a system that often disregarded the poor and working class Americans. Do you think it's fair that so many people were left behind in the name of political power? 87. His constant undermining of the judicial system showed a disregard for the fundamental principles that keep a society just. How does it feel to know your vote helped embolden that attack on fairness? You voted for someone who put personal interests above the greater good. How do you feel about supporting a leader whose actions often served his own ego rather than the needs of the country? Trump's stance on women's health care was an attack on their right to choose. How can you support a policy that takes away the ability for women to make decisions about their own bodies? A president whose leadership was marked by ignorance and dishonesty. How do you feel about being part of a movement that prioritized power over truth? Trump's constant conflict with the media led to the weakening of journalistic integrity. Can you stand by a leader who didn't respect the value of an independent press? His presidency gave rise to hate groups and emboldened white supremacy. How do you feel knowing your vote was part of empowering those who seek to divide and destroy? You voted for a man who frequently attacked the very foundation of democratic norms. Do you feel good about supporting someone who eroded the values that make America strong? 94. When you cast your vote for Trump, you helped create a world where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. How does that fit with your vision of the American dream? Trump's tax policies favored the wealthy and corporations. How do you feel about a system where those who need it most are left out, while the richest continue to reap the benefits? 96, supporting Trump meant putting people at risk by neglecting public health measures. Can you justify voting for someone whose inaction led to so many preventable deaths? Trump often disrespected women, and you voted for him. How do you reconcile that with the women you care about in your life? How does that sit with you? By supporting Trump, you backed a government that actively tried to disenfranchise voters. Do you feel that's fair? Shouldn't every voice count in a democracy? His reckless handling of foreign relations put the country's security in jeopardy. How do you feel knowing that your vote contributed to that kind of leadership? Trump's time in office wasn't just about policy, it was about setting a tone. How do you feel about contributing to a political atmosphere where cruelty and corruption were normalized? I've addressed this directly to the voters, each statement aiming to prompt reflection on their support for Donald Trump with
Very good.
Thank you. I'm glad you're happy with the direction. I'll continue addressing the men who voted for Donald Trump, maintaining a focus on diverse perspectives and avoiding repetition. Not at 101. By voting for Trump, you supported policies that made it harder for immigrants to achieve the American dream. How does that align with your beliefs in fairness and opportunity for all? Trump's administration consistently attacked environmental protections. Does it sit right with you that by voting for him, you backed policies that could harm the planet for future generations? When Trump undermined the rights of journalists, he undermined your right to a free press. Those who hold the powerful accountable. You voted for a man who failed to protect the most vulnerable among us, those with disabilities and chronic illnesses. How do you justify supporting?
Uh-oh. I messed it up.
Thank you. I'm glad you're happy with the direction. I'll continue addressing the men who voted for Donald Trump, maintaining a focus on diverse perspectives and avoiding repetition. By voting for Trump, you supported policies that made it harder for immigrants to achieve the American dream. How does that align with your beliefs in fairness and opportunity for all? Trump's administration consistently attacked environmental protections. Does it sit right with you that by voting for him, you backed policies that could harm the planet for future generations? 103. When Trump undermined the rights of journalists, he undermined your right to a free press. How do you feel about supporting a leader who targeted those who hold the powerful accountable? You voted for a man who failed to protect the most vulnerable among us, those with disabilities and chronic illnesses. How do you justify supporting an administration that cuts services and protections for them? Trump's foreign policy often put American citizens at risk by creating unnecessary tensions with our allies. How does it feel to know your vote contributed to that global instability? Under Trump, the working class struggle intensified, with cuts to vital social safety nets. How does it feel to be part of a movement that left hardworking Americans to fend for themselves? 107. Trump often attacked people based on their race, religion, or nationality. How do you feel about being aligned with a leader whose rhetoric fueled division and hatred? When you voted for Trump, you helped cement the idea that America's leaders don't have to be truthful.
Come on. Let's see.
Thank you. I'm glad you're happy with the direction. I'll continue addressing the men who voted for Donald Trump, maintaining a focus on diverse perspectives and avoiding repetition. By voting for Trump, you supported policies that made it harder for immigrants to achieve the American dream. How does that align with your beliefs in fairness, and opportunity for all? Trump's administration consistently attacked environmental protections. Does it sit right with you that by voting for him, you backed policies that could harm the planet for future generations? 103. When Trump undermined the rights of journalists, he undermined your right to a free press. How do you feel about supporting a leader who targeted those who hold the powerful accountable? You voted for a man who failed to protect the most vulnerable among us, those with disabilities and chronic illnesses. How do you justify supporting an administration that cuts services and protections for them? Trump's foreign policy often put American citizens at risk by creating unnecessary tensions with our allies. How does it feel to know your vote contributed to that global instability? Under Trump, the working class struggle intensified, with cuts to vital social safety nets. How does it feel to be part of a movement that left hardworking Americans to fend for themselves? 107. Trump often attacked people based on their race, religion, or nationality. How do you feel about being aligned with a leader whose rhetoric fueled division and hatred? When you voted for Trump, you helped cement the idea that America's leaders don't have to be truthful. Does it trouble you that dishonesty became a defining characteristic of his presidency? 109. Trump's administration rolled back protections for clean water and air. Do you feel comfortable knowing that your vote supported a government that disregarded environmental safety for public health? Supporting Trump meant supporting an agenda that put profits before people's safety and well-being. How does it feel to know that your vote contributed to policies that prioritize corporate interests over individual lives? 111. Trump's attitude toward women was dismissive and degrading. How do you justify voting for someone who showed such disrespect toward women, particularly when you consider how many women are affected by his policies? By supporting Trump, you helped normalize attacks on democratic norms. How do you feel knowing that your vote contributed to eroding the very foundation of a system meant to protect freedom and equality? 13. His disregard for healthcare meant that millions of Americans remained without necessary treatment. Does it sit well with you that your vote helped a leader actively fight against universal access to healthcare? Trump's tax policies favored the wealthiest Americans. How do you feel about being part of a movement that further enriched the few while leaving so many others in economic distress? 115. When Trump downplayed the pandemic, he risked countless lives. How does it feel to know that your vote supported an administration that failed to take meaningful action in the face of a global health crisis? By voting for Trump, you backed an administration that routinely undermined scientific evidence. How do you feel about supporting policies that rejected expert opinions on everything from climate change to public health? His policies on education and public funding prioritized private interests over the needs of students. How do you reconcile that with the belief that everyone deserves access to quality education, regardless of their income? Trump's administration rolled back progress made toward racial equality. How do you feel about supporting someone whose actions and rhetoric often left marginalized communities behind? 119. When you voted for Trump, you put power in the hands of people who were indifferent to the pain of those less fortunate. How do you feel about being aligned with an administration that acted with such disregard for others? Trump's refusal to concede after the 2020 election incited violence and chaos. How do you justify supporting someone who threatened the very core of democracy itself? 121. His policies often disproportionately affected women, particularly in terms of reproductive rights. How does it feel to know that your vote helped limit women's access to essential healthcare? Under Trump, the government disregarded the needs of the most vulnerable, including the elderly. How do you feel about supporting an administration that took actions that put those who depend on social services at risk? Trump's treatment of veterans was often dismissive, even as they struggled to get the care they needed. Do you feel right about supporting a man whose administration failed to meet the needs of those who served the country? By voting for Trump, you enabled an atmosphere of division and hostility. How do you feel about contributing to a society where political discourse became increasingly toxic? 125. Trump's indifference to the separation of families at the border was heartbreaking. Can you support an agenda that caused such human suffering, especially when you consider the impact on children? 6. The Trump administration's stance on gun control often favored the interests of the NRA over public safety. How do you feel about voting for policies that made it easier for dangerous weapons to proliferate in the hands of those who shouldn't have them? 127. When you voted for Trump, you supported a president whose actions seemed more about personal gain than national unity. How do you justify aligning with someone who prioritized his own interests over the country's welfare? Trump's embrace of conspiracy theories made it difficult for many people to discern truth from fiction. Do you think supporting someone who spread these falsehoods helped create a more informed electorate? His 29. His presidency often disregarded the rights of indigenous communities. How do you reconcile voting for someone whose actions often led to the further marginalization of Native Americans? Under Trump, the country saw a sharp rise in hate crimes. How does it feel knowing your vote empowered a leader whose rhetoric contributed to the increase in violence? When you voted for Trump, you helped enable a government that attacked basic freedoms, including the right to protest. How do you feel about supporting a system that stifled dissent? Trump's decisions often put American workers at risk, particularly with his trade wars. Do you feel justified in supporting policies that jeopardize the livelihood of so many? 133. His attacks on immigrants were constant and unrelenting. How do you feel about voting for someone who put up barriers instead of fostering the inclusive society that America has always been known for? Trump's refusal to take responsibility for his actions left the country without clear accountability. How do you reconcile supporting a leader who refused to own up to his mistakes? 135. When you voted for Trump, you voted to restrict the rights of the LGBTQ+ community. Can you stand behind policies that perpetuate discrimination against people based sexual orientation or gender identity? Trump's disregard for the poor and working class was evident in his tax cuts for the wealthy. How does it feel knowing that your vote contributed to a system that made the rich even richer, while the rest of the country continued to struggle? His lack of empathy for victims of natural disasters showed a troubling indifference to human suffering. How do you feel knowing your vote supported a government that failed to adequately respond to tragedies? You voted for a president who used his platform to divide the country at every opportunity. How do you reconcile that with the need for unity and collective action to address national challenges? By supporting Trump, you endorsed an agenda that cared more about political power than the public good. How does that sit with you in terms of your personal values and priorities? Trump's presidency was marked by constant legal battles and controversies. How do you feel about supporting a leader whose time in office was overshadowed by scandal and legal issues? Continuing to directly engage with the concerns and reflections of men who voted for Donald Trump, I hope this collection of questions is useful for provoking thought. Let me know how you'd like me to proceed.
Let's continue. We have more questions. I was really carried away. I like these questions. I always just wonder what were Trump voters
Absolutely.
thinking.
I'll keep going with more direct questions and reflections for men who voted for Donald Trump in the same tone and approach. 141. Trump's administration regularly undermined workers' rights, weakening protections for those who keep our economy running. How do you feel knowing your vote helped a president who continuously chipped away at labor rights? Under Trump, the country saw a widening wealth gap. Does it trouble you that your vote may have supported policies that exacerbated economic inequality, leaving hardworking families behind? 143. Trump consistently undermined trust in the judicial system, casting doubt on the integrity of the courts. How do you justify voting for a president who sought to politicize one of the most vital institutions in our democracy? When you voted for Trump, you supported a leader who often played to the worst aspects of human nature, fueling racism, sexism, and intolerance. How do you reconcile your support for someone who spread such divisive rhetoric? 145. The Trump administration's treatment of the press was often hostile and dismissive. How does it sit with you that by supporting him, you backed an agenda that sought to silence the free press? Trump's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic was disastrous, leaving millions vulnerable. Do you feel comfortable knowing that your vote helped elect someone whose actions exacerbated the crisis and put lives at risk? By supporting Trump, you voted to uphold an agenda that consistently ignored the reality of climate change. How do you feel about backing a leader who disregarded the planet's future? Trump's response to mass shootings was often to deflect or minimize the problem, refusing to take meaningful action on gun control. How do you feel about supporting someone who failed to address an issue that affects so many lives?
Yeah.
His administration's focus on tax cuts for the wealthy left essential social programs underfunded. How do you justify voting for someone whose policies resulted in cuts to the programs that many Americans rely on? When you voted for Trump, you enabled a president whose foreign policy often favored dictators over democratically elected leaders. How do you feel about supporting a leader who gave legitimacy to authoritarian regimes? Trump's tax cuts overwhelmingly benefited the wealthiest individuals while leaving the working class to shoulder the burden. How does it sit with you that your vote contributed to an economic system that further concentrated wealth in the hands of the few? 152. Under Trump, the country witnessed a decline in trust between law enforcement and communities of color. How do you feel about supporting policies that deepened the divide between police forces and the people they are meant to protect? Trump often downplayed the importance of racial justice, even in the face of protests calling for systemic change. How do you feel knowing your vote contributed to a system that disregarded the cries for equality? 254, his policies on immigration were harsh and dehumanizing, separating families and detaining children in overcrowded camps. How does it feel to know that your vote supported an administration that caused so much suffering to innocent people? By voting for Trump, you empowered a leader who routinely disregarded facts in favor of conspiracy theories. How do you justify supporting someone whose actions undermine truth and reality? 156. Trump's stance on healthcare left millions without affordable access to medical care. Do you feel justified in supporting a president who sought to eliminate protections that many Americans relied on for their well-being? When you voted for Trump, you helped elect someone who undermined democratic institutions and threatened the integrity of elections. How do you feel about backing a leader who so frequently attacked the very pillars of democracy? Trump's constant attacks on the judiciary raised concerns about the independence of the courts. How do you reconcile voting for a man who openly attempted to undermine one of the key checks and balances in our system of government? 159. His presidency frequently undermined the rights of workers, rolling back crucial labor protections. How does it feel to support a man who prioritized corporate profits over the well-being of working class Americans? 160. Trump's rhetoric often encouraged violence, especially among his most fervent supporters. How do you feel about supporting a leader whose words and actions stirred up aggression and conflict in communities across the country? Under Trump, the US withdrew from international agreements aimed at reducing carbon emissions, which could have long-term consequences for the planet. How do you feel about supporting policies that put short-term interests ahead of the planet's future? When you voted for Trump, you helped further a political agenda that frequently dismissed science in favor of personal and corporate interests. How does it sit with you that your vote may have contributed to policies that ignored expert advice? 163. Trump's handling of the economy was marked by favoring the interests of large corporations over small businesses. How do you justify voting for policies that disproportionately benefited big corporations while neglecting small businesses and workers? His divisive rhetoric often pitted Americans against one another, fueling hostility between political groups. How do you feel about supporting a leader who sowed division rather than promoting unity in a time when the country needed it most? The Trump administration's stance on women's reproductive rights led to a rollback of critical protections for women's health. How does it feel to support a president whose policies made it harder for women to access essential healthcare? Trump's consistent failure to condemn white supremacy and far-right extremism was a dangerous precedent. How do you feel about voting for someone who refused to speak out against hate groups in this country? 167. His failure to acknowledge the severity of the climate crisis has long-term ramifications for future generations. How do you justify supporting an administration that actively worked against measures to protect the environment? 168. By voting for Trump, you helped create an administration that favored the rich and powerful over working families. How does it sit with you that your vote helped strengthen a system that leaves so many behind? 69. Trump's refusal to engage in meaningful dialogue with other world leaders weakened the global alliances that kept the world safe. How do you feel about supporting a president who often put personal vendettas ahead of international diplomacy? 170, his use of inflammatory language often put public servants, including police officers and journalists, at risk. How do you reconcile voting for someone who put these individuals in harm's way through careless rhetoric? Trump's policies disproportionately affected minority communities, making it harder for them to access the resources they needed. How do you justify supporting an agenda that actively harmed these vulnerable groups? Under Trump, the country saw an increase in attacks on civil rights protections for LGBTQ+ individuals. How do you feel about voting for someone who sought to reverse hard-won progress on LGBTQ+ equality? Trump's aggressive stance toward trade negotiations harmed American farmers and workers, especially in key industries. How do you feel about supporting an administration that put these communities at risk with unpredictable trade policies? His policies often ignored the reality of systemic racism, opting instead to attack peaceful protesters. How does it sit with you to know that your vote helped a leader dismiss the need for racial justice? Trump's administration was often marked by a lack of accountability and transparency. How do you feel about supporting someone who regularly circumvented the checks and balances in place to ensure fair governance? This continues to directly address men who voted for Donald Trump with thought-provoking questions. Let me know how you'd like me to proceed, or if there's anything specific you want me to focus on.
She did ask for direction, didn't she? All right, let's see these last set, and then I will respond, or we'll have a chat with AI to respond. I really haven't written down all my notes about what I think about everything she's saying, which is quite a lot. But let's continue. This is the last
Absolutely. Set. I'll continue directly addressing Trump voters with more reflections and questions. 176. Trump's disregard for the well-being of veterans, including cuts to healthcare services for them, is alarming. How do you feel knowing your vote contributed to a system that failed to properly care for those who served this country? The Trump administration often minimized the importance of protecting public lands and natural resources. How do you reconcile supporting a leader whose policies undermined conservation efforts and jeopardized the environment? 178. When you voted for Trump, you helped elect a man who frequently dismissed the concerns of people of color, particularly in regards to racial inequality. How do you feel knowing your vote played a part in reinforcing a system that ignored these critical issues? Trump's handling of the opioid crisis was lackluster at best, with his administration often downplaying the scale of the problem. How do you justify voting for a leader who failed to take meaningful action to combat this national epidemic? His attempts to weaken healthcare protections under the Affordable Care Act left millions without proper coverage. How do you feel knowing your vote helped a man who sought to strip away healthcare for millions of vulnerable Americans? 181. The Trump administration's stance on net neutrality endangered the free and open internet. How does it sit with you to know that your vote helped elect a leader who supported policies that could stifle online freedom? Trump's repeated attacks on the Affordable Care Act put the health of millions of Americans at risk. How do you feel about supporting a president whose policies could have taken away the healthcare coverage of many people? Trump's administration consistently undermined environmental regulations, making it harder to address pollution and climate change. How do you feel about voting for a man whose actions have made it more difficult to protect the planet for future generations? 184. And when Trump disregarded the science behind the climate crisis, he sent a dangerous message. How does it sit with you to know that your vote contributed to policies that ignored the facts and jeopardized the future of the planet? Trump's policies often resulted in a divided country, increasing polarization rather than fostering a unified America. How do you feel knowing that your vote helped create an environment where division and animosity were encouraged? 186. The Trump administration repeatedly attacked the rights of workers, making it harder for them to organize and secure better wages. How do you feel about voting for a man who undermined labor rights, making it harder for people to achieve fair pay and better working conditions? 7. Trump's policies favored deregulation, which often benefited large corporations at the expense of consumers and workers. How do you justify supporting a president who placed corporate interests above the needs of everyday Americans? Under Trump, the country saw a rise in hate crimes and political violence, partly fueled by his rhetoric. How do you feel about voting for someone who contributed to an atmosphere of fear and distrust rather than promoting unity and peace? Trump's constant attacks on immigrants and refugees created an environment of fear and hatred. How do you feel knowing that your vote helped put in place policies that harmed people simply seeking a better life? Trump's divisive language often minimized the significance of the Me Too movement, failing to acknowledge the importance of fighting sexual violence. How do you reconcile voting for a man who downplayed the issues of gender inequality and sexual harassment? 191. His administration often minimized the significance of the Black Lives Matter movement, which was focused on addressing systemic racial injustice. How do you feel about voting for a president who failed to acknowledge the urgent need for racial justice in this country? When Trump pulled the US out of the Paris Climate Agreement, he sent a message that climate change was not a priority. How do you justify supporting a president who not only ignored climate science, but also actively worked to dismantle efforts to combat global warming? Trump's administration undermined education by cutting funding for public schools, while promoting privatization and charter schools. How does it feel to know that your vote helped elect a president whose policies hurt public education? 194, under Trump, there was little to no action on addressing infrastructure needs, despite the country's crumbling roads and bridges. How do you feel about supporting a leader who neglected the vital investments necessary to improve America's infrastructure? Trump's constant undermining of experts and dismissing of facts has made it harder for the country to move forward with informed decision-making. How do you feel about voting for someone who disregarded science and expertise on issues like healthcare, the environment, and public safety? 196. Trump often made excuses for autocratic leaders and dictators while alienating democratic allies. How do you feel about supporting someone who consistently undermined America's standing on the world stage and weakened its alliances with democratic nations? 197. The Trump administration's tax cuts disproportionately benefited the rich, while many working class families saw little to no benefit. How do you feel about supporting an economic agenda that deepened wealth inequality? 198. Trump's presidency saw increased rhetoric that labeled peaceful protesters as thugs and enemies of the state. How does it sit with you that your vote contributed to policies that vilified those calling for justice and equality? 199. Trump's lack of leadership during the Black Lives Matter protests sent a message that the concerns of Black Americans didn't matter.
Black lives do
How do you
matter.
reconcile voting
I'm
for a
surprised
man
that's
who
a question
failed
for
to
you.
take a strong stance against racial injustice? The Trump administration's approach to immigration, including the policy of separating families at the border, was seen as inhumane by many. How do you feel about voting for someone whose policies led to such human suffering? 201. Trump's constant undermining of international organizations like the United Nations weakened the global efforts to address crises. How do you justify supporting a president who isolated America on the world stage, making it harder for countries to work together on global issues? Trump's refusal to accept the results of the 2020 election undermined the integrity of American democracy. How do you feel knowing that your vote helped elect a man who disregarded the peaceful transfer of power, a cornerstone of democracy? Trump's administration's refusal to act on the opioid epidemic led to unnecessary deaths. How do you feel about supporting a president whose policies ignored the needs of those suffering from addiction? 204. Trump's disregard for the rights of the LGBTQ+ community, including his support for policies that rolled back protections, is concerning. How do you feel about voting for someone who actively worked against the progress of LGBTQ+ equality? Under Trump, healthcare became less accessible and more expensive for many Americans. How do you justify voting for a man who sought to dismantle protections that ensured millions could afford healthcare? 206. Trump's constant use of fear tactics and divisive language only served to exacerbate national tensions. How do you feel about voting for a man who sought to instill fear rather than encourage unity in a time of crisis? Trump's refusal to address the growing issue of income inequality and workers' rights left many Americans struggling to make ends meet. How do you feel about supporting an agenda that failed to address the needs of working people? 8. Trump's decision to repeatedly attack the media led to a deterioration in the relationship between journalists and the public. How do you feel knowing that your vote contributed to an erosion of trust in the very institutions that hold our government accountable? Trump's rhetoric often encouraged a culture of cruelty and disregard for human decency. How do you justify voting for someone whose actions and words perpetuated a climate of hate and disrespect? 210. When you voted for Trump, you helped elect a man who valued personal gain over the well-being of the American people. How does it feel to support a leader whose policies often prioritized his own interests above the needs of the many? This continues the direct, reflective approach in speaking to men who voted for Trump. If you would like more or specific adjustments, feel free to let me know.
Okay, I'll tell you what I have to say to AI. That this is what I typed. Remarkably blind to the failures of mainstream media and the DNC too. So much of this goes both ways. Dems are just voice service to the problems. The GOP and the DNC are woefully unaware. Oh, AI was woefully unaware. It was 2025. It was like giving me all like Trump's first term in office information instead of his first 100 days in office, which was more what I was going for. But Trump has just been so bad for so long. I'm astounded people vote for him at all. I don't understand how you could just disregard women like that. But anyway, let's see what AI has to say about what I said.
Below is an overview of President Trump's first 100 days of his second term, highlighting his key actions, the reactions and failures of mainstream media, and missteps by Democratic leadership. Trump has governed almost exclusively by executive action, issuing 142 orders in his opening 100 days to reshape immigration, curtail diversity programs, pardon January 6 rioters, and roll back environmental protections. Cite turn search 5, turn 1 search 6. He fired or demoted dozens of Justice Department officials involved in investigations of him and his allies, signaling a purge of deep state actors. On day one, he wiped out all federal chief diversity officers, halted anti-bias training, and branded DEI initiatives immoral. Cite turn search 2. Economically, his aggressive tariff hikes stoked market volatility. Wall Street dips followed new levies on China and Europe, while his family profited via crypto ventures and high-ticket Mar-a-Lago events, raising fresh conflict of interest alarms. Cite turn News 422. Despite promises, he failed to secure major congressional tax cuts, and his moves on energy, withdrawing from the Paris Pact and freezing offshore wind leases, have created trade and climate uncertainty. Cite turn search 15M. Foreign policy was marked by abrupt reversals, halting Ukraine aid while praising autocrats, threatening to annex Greenland and straining NATO ties that many viewed as reckless and unilateral. Search 4 turn 1 News 12. His refugee suspension and stepped-up deportations provoked legal challenges and widespread criticism of overreach. Cite turn 1 News 10. On January 20th, he pardoned over 1,500 January 6 rioters, among them Proud Boys and Oath Keepers, undermining accountability and prompting warnings that such clemency could incite further political violence. Cite turn search turn 1 search. Media coverage and mainstream media. Relentless negativity and bias. Major networks ran 92% negative segments on Trump as his 100th day approached, illustrating a uniformly hostile tone that many argue borders on propaganda rather than journalism. Cite turn search 3. Lack of context and inconsistent standards. Editorials from the Washington Post, Times, and Wall Street Journal decried his tariff and civil rights rollbacks, but often ignored similar executive overreach by prior administrations. Cite turn News 11. Critics like Michael Goodwin contend that outlets such as the New York Times and NPR fear losing narrative control more than they value truth-seeking, and that Trump's defunding of PBS NPR exposed legacy media's dependence on political patronage. Failure to cover Democratic failures. Mainstream outlets have largely failed to examine the Democratic National Committee's inability to offer a coherent alternative, instead parroting resistance talking points without detailing policy substitutes or highlighting DNC's past miscalculations. Cite turn search 69. DNC and Democratic leadership missteps. Over-reliance on talking heads. Prominent Democrats, from cable pundits to party consultants, have repeated stale critiques, authoritarian, racist, that elicit applause but do little to forge a winning message or substantive reform agenda. Cite turn 1 search 39. Failure to center voters' concerns. Figures like Senator Cory Booker have acknowledged that Democrats' biggest error was obsessing over politics instead of addressing everyday economic and social anxieties, leaving a vacuum Trump exploits. Cite turn 1 search though. Underestimating grassroots movements. The party has also ignored rising independent and third-party initiatives, Green Party, worker coalitions, focusing instead on bipartisanship illusions rather than building new coalitions for change. Impact and looking ahead. Polarization deepens. Trump's sweeping orders and the media's relentless condemnation have intensified social divides rather than bridged them. Democratic reckoning needed. Without a bold, voter-centered agenda, Democrats risk ceding more ground to a White House that governs by decree. Media reinvention. True accountability demands more than hostile sound bites. It requires nuanced coverage that holds all parties, Republicans and Democrats, equally accountable. In sum, Trump's first 100 days have been a whirlwind of authoritarian-style governing, punctuated by personal profiteering, met by media echo chambers and Democratic leadership still searching for its footing. The question now is whether the press and the DNC can evolve fast enough to offer the electorate a clear, compelling alternative.
Green Party suppression. Even you are guilty. No, we don't need to pretend the media is the free press or anything close to it. They're not ethical, they're not centrism? Centrism is not ethical. Like, to pretend like centrism in the free press or in the so-called free press is what we need is ridiculous. Like, 92% plus negative stories about Donald Trump sounds remarkably accurate. We need to keep people alive, and we, America, y'all, elected someone who doesn't care about keeping people alive. Like, why did you voters do that? Like, it boggles my mind how you voted for people. And then I just went and listened to this list with you, and I still cannot figure it out. Like, how do Trump voters vote for Trump? Baffling. Let's see what else she has to say. Oh, I didn't read you my little comment. Did I? Did I read you half of it? I started talking about centrism. We need to keep people alive for their entire natural lifetimes, truly care for all people, literally, mutual aid in politics, and American Christians considering Jesus' teachings for real. It is all about Green Party politics, even if you are guilty. What? I see talk to text edited what I said. Oh well. Let's see what ChatGPT had to say.
Here's a roadmap for moving beyond hollow centrism and forging a politics and a faith that truly cares for every life from cradle to grave.
Summary.
Ethical centrism built on a dying biased media is a dead end. We need a politics of mutual aid, grounded in Green Party eco-socialism and a Christian revival of Jesus' teachings on wealth, care, and solidarity. By building our own networks of care, from faith communities to worker assemblies,